Hey everyone, this is Kevin from thechesswebsite.com, and today we're going to be going over a pretty unique opening, and that is the Grob attack. Just so happens to be my most requested video over the past couple years. Typically I respond to people requesting and saying you should just not play this because it's not very strong, but more and more people continue to request it, so I thought I'd go ahead and make a video, go over the key concept for those people who've never played this, generally because it's not that strong, and then some of the traps that you can get your opponent into, because most people, they don't play it, most people haven't played against it, and they just don't even know where to start with this. So we'll go ahead and get into it, specifically the main lines and then some of the variations that you may see from that. Now, some of the things that you can see right off the bat is this does weaken the king side of the board. So with that, you're generally not looking to castle on the king side. Now, you still may sometimes, but your king safety really comes from the center of the board for most of your game. So you're not going to be pushing your pawns towards the center very often until you've established an attack or a defense, and then maybe you decide to push forward. But for the most part, you're going to be attacking from the outside. So more of that hyper-modern defense, attacking where you're fianchettoing your bishops, you're getting your knights involved into the game, and you're attacking from the flanks here. Pawn to c4 is going to be pretty common. Pawn g4 if you want to march up the board. Pawn to h4 later on. You'll see that in the variations that we go over. Usually black is going to start out with the main line, and that is pawn to d5. This attacks the center of the board, and it also opens up the door for this light square bishop to immediately attack this pawn right here on g4. Now there's a couple ways that white can always continue, and there's going to be some, if you look at it, is more textbook, like this is a stronger move, but you're not playing the Grob attack for the best possible move from a textbook standpoint. So I'm going to go over what I consider the best attacking move. Partly it's more fun that way, but it's subjectively almost as strong as some of the other moves, but I think you're going to get better results, especially if you're playing a human. There's more times that they can fall into a trap. So those are the lines that I'm going to be recommending that you play if you are going to opt for the Grob attack. It's always going to start out with bishop to g2, fianchettoing this bishop, especially if they're playing pawn to d5. You want to attack this pawn right here. You don't mind if they take your pawn here on a g4. You're not playing it because it's going to be, well protected, and hopefully you're not really interested in the Grob attack because you want to play pawn to h3. Like, this is just the most boring opening that you could possibly play. Bishop to g2 all of a sudden says, hey, if you want to take my pawn right here, then I can start to do some things. And the first thing you're going to be doing is pawn to c4. This opens up the threat of, after the pawn takes, then the bishop can take here on b7. The light square bishop is left the building, and so all of a sudden this light square bishop can take this rook here on a8. Now black doesn't necessarily have to fall for this, and even if they decide to play knight to d7, black is going to still have a fine game here, but it's a much different game than they may have expected when they came out here and took this pawn here on g4, because now the bishop can take here on a8, queen takes here on a8, pawn to f3, very important move right here since the queen is attacking this rook. Let's say the bishop comes back here to f5, and then queen up here to a4. This is pinning down the knight, also attacking the pawn here on c4. So this is going to be a completely fine opening for white. White does hold a small advantage in this position. Now, black's not always going to take this pawn here on c4. This is for someone that's just not really paying attention, and they don't really see that this bishop here on g2 can take right here. More often than not, instead of the pawn taking here on c4, you're going to see some other variation. So we'll go over some of the main things that you'd see. The first variation that you may see in this position is pawn to c6, solidifying the pawn chain, also blocking this long light square diagonal, which white is really trying to control in this position. From here, white's going to play queen to b3. Another theme that you'll see is after you play pawn to c4, you're really trying to get the queen here on b3 for two reasons. One is it also controls the center, specifically this d5 square, the pawn, the queen, and the bishop all attacking that. It also attacks this pawn here on b7. So lots of things that white is trying to do in this position. Now, you could see lots of different ways that black tries to defend this. You could see pawn to b6. From here, white's just going to take right here, and it's tricky because they can't really take back with their pawn, because then you're just going to see the queen take. The queen is attacking the rook. It's being defended by the bishop as well. So queen takes, bishop takes, the rook is going to fall. Black's in a terrible position right here. But instead, we could see the bishop come back here to d7. Okay, well now we could say pawn to d4, maybe knight to f6, attacking our pawn, and then pawn up here to e4. All of a sudden, white has a very strong central defense, and this is a point where it's okay to start pushing forward in front of the king. Black's not putting any pressure on white. White's now being the aggressor on the board, so you can see when it's okay to start pushing forward in the game. Instead of b6, you may see black try something else. Queen to d7 makes a lot of sense. Knight to c3, white continuing to put more pieces in play that are going to attack the square in the center of the board. Maybe pawn to e5 as far as just trying to control the center of the board. But white can now start to gobble up material. Queen takes here. If there wants to be an exchange, that's fine. White could recapture with the knight or the bishop. I think either of these are going to be okay for white. Now, that was if we see black play pawn to c6. Could also defend with something like pawn to e6. From here, white's going to continue the same thing, queen to b3. Now there's a few options from here. Maybe we see knight to c6, then we see the exchange in the center of the board. Now knight to c3. I think this is going to be completely fine for white. Doesn't have an advantage necessarily in the board state because there still is that weakened king side of the board, but I think white has a very playable position and has a lot of active pieces. Now instead of knight to c6, you could see something like pawn to b6. You never really know exactly how your opponent's going to respond, and sometimes they look at this, they see the threat of queen up here to b7, and they think the best way to defend this is pawn to b6. Well, now we could take with our pawn right here, and they can't really take back because now bishop here to e5, this is going to be very, very bad for them. There's no way to stop this profitably. Now you may initially look at this and say, yes, the bishop is attacking the rook right here on a8, but it's pretty easy to stop that, just pawn here to c6. But that's not actually the threat that white has going on. Instead, we have the bishop and the queen both eyeing down this pawn here on f7. This is the weakest square on the board because the king is the only one defending this. Now the king is forced to move. Then you could take this material right here on g8. It's also protected by the queen here on b3, so just going to be able to gobble up material right here. You can see what a terrible position this is for black now. And it was just trying to stop the threat over here on the queen side of the board. Now, if we come back and say, what if black now realizes this and instead plays bishop up here to e6? Okay, well now we're not going to be taking the rook up here on a8 because we don't want to lose our queen, but now the bishop could take, the pawn's going to take, queen's going to come up here, take that pawn, get material back on the board. You can look at it right here and say white has more pawns than black. All of a sudden, black's king is out in the open. It's going to be tough to defend this. White can start to develop his pieces. White's going to have a very, very good game in this position. You also may see some other variations, pawn to e5 if you think they're just going to control the center of the board. I'd go ahead and take right here on d5, maybe knight to f6, attacking the pawn, knight up here to c3, defending it. Then you can get your queen involved into the board here to b3. So those are some options. Instead of pawn to e5, one thing I have seen quite often is knight to f6. And there's a lot of things to keep in mind if you do see knight to f6. One is you want to get your queen involved to b3. There's some traps that you have here that are very common, but you also have to be aware of some traps that you can have against yourself. One of those would be to lose your queen if you take up here on b7 and then you don't retreat quick enough. As an example, let's say from here they play pawn to e6. Pretty common, and then you take up here on b7. They're just giving you that material. And then they play knight here to d7. Then you take material right here. You play knight up here to c3, attacking this pawn. and then they play knight here to c5. Your queen is lost. You really need to play something else. You need to get that queen back to safety. Once you play knight to c3, which looks like a good move, unfortunately it's not going to, because after knight to c5, there's no way to hold on to your queen. Now you could look at it and say, what about queen to b4? They can't attack it right here. Well, now we have knight to d3 check, and this is forking the queen, but also after the pawn takes, the bishop can come down and take this queen here on b4. Now, back in the position, what if we play queen to c6? This is going to be check, but then black can just bring his bishop back here to d7, and there's no way to properly defend that queen. Another thing to look at, queen to b5, this is check, but then pawn to c6, that's going to put an end to our fun. Maybe the queen takes, bishop up here to d7, and the queen is going to fall. So just keep that in mind. If you are going to take the pawn up here on b7, best thing you need to be thinking about is how can I retreat to make sure I do not lose my queen. Now, one of the most common traps you'll be putting on your opponent if you play the Grob attack comes from this position, but white's not going to be taking the pawn up here to b7. So if you're worried about your queen being captured, I just wouldn't worry about taking that. Instead, I would go ahead and take with your pawn right here on d5. And many times black is going to fall for this trap because they feel like they need to take with their knight here on d5. It's protected, it's a great outpost for the knight, and they just feel like, hey, if I take my pawn right here, it's just kind of by itself, and then, you know, what are they really looking to do here? They don't have an aggressive position. Unfortunately for them, this is going to fall to queen to a4 check. Their bishop over here on g4 is now a sitting duck. It's really tough because they don't have a lot of material in the Grob attack to defend this bishop here on g4, and they don't want to waste their time retreating the bishop because white's generally attacking from the very beginning. And so from here, it doesn't really matter how black continues. Knight to c6, this bishop is going to fall over here on g4. Now, that is an attack if we look at it from this position after black plays pawn to e6. You have to be careful depending on how black could continue, because something you could see is pawn to c6. Now, if you look at it and say pawn takes, and now the knight takes here, okay, well, now you look at it and say, I'm going to go ahead and take with my queen up here to b7. Now knight to d7, and it looks like that this pawn right here on c6 is open. It's not being defended right now, but one of the things that black has to, or one of the things that white has to think about is the back rank make. And you look at this and say, where's the back rank make? And that is the bishop, or the queen takes here on c6, excuse me, and then rook to c8. And this is the threat of, if this queen moves, this bishop down here is going to fall, and it is going to be a checkmate. So, you know, queen takes here on d5, and it is going to fall right here. The game is over. Now, if you look at it and say, how does white continue right here? Well, you could see the bishop take the knight here on d5. Queen's going to fall here on c6. The bishop's going to recapture here. Queen here to c8, attacking the bishop. Maybe bishop takes here, exchanges. King takes on d7. Yes, white has material on the board, but black does have that queen, has the bishop pair. This is going to be a position where black is actually favored, and it's going to be difficult for white to really continue in this spot. It has no pieces or pawns developed in this position. Black should have an easy game attacking his opponent. So just keep that in mind if you are playing white in that position. Just be looking to make sure that they can't come over, bring their rook here, c8, attacking the queen, forcing or a move that's going to end up poorly if you have to worry about this back rank make here with the rook taking on c1. Now, we looked at the more common lines that you will see. You also see some just crazy openings that people have no idea how to respond. So you could see knight to f6. Simple development move. They feel like this is pretty common. Gets their knight involved. It protects this pawn right here. They don't know what you're doing. So, hey, you're attacking it with your bishop. So I'm just going to continue my normal development. You're going to push forward with g5. You're not playing pawn up here to g4 because it's this powerful pawn that you really care about. You're looking to sacrifice that thing as early as move 2. So push it up here to g5. Now, depending on where they do, you're just going to chase them around the board. Knight to e4 makes some sense. Pawn to d3 opens up the board for this this dark square bishop to defend this pawn here on g5. Also attacks this knight here. Maybe the knight moves back here to d6. And then white can take this material here on d5. Much better if they bring the knight back here to c5, but it doesn't look that easy for them to find. And even from here, white's going to have a pretty good game. Now, if we come back to the beginning, and that was if they played knight to f6 after d5, you may still see some people that after pawn to g4, they just play pawn to e5. And then you're going to continue with the same thing, bishop here to g2. And you may even see knight to f6 in this position. That's just a common move that they typically play after e5, and they're just going to let you do your thing. They don't know what you're doing, but it's much worse in this position because after pawn to g5, they no longer have the option to bring the knight down here to e4. Before, they had their pawn on d5. It was a nice little outpost. They could defend it if white were to capture with the bishop. Black does not have that option here, so instead, they're going to have a few things they can do. Bring it back here to g8, which this just feels terrible for black to waste a move so early in the game. They could bring it here to h5. White's just going to start attacking pawn to d4, just starting to attack the center of the board. Black has a knight over here on h5 that's not doing anything. This is going to be good for white. Or if it wants to come down here to g4, then white can play pawn to h3. It's going to be tough for black to not lose material in this position. Really has to come down and take with his knight on f2. King's going to come here, take here on f2. Yes, white has an exposed king, doesn't have a lot of kingside safety, but that's not why you're playing the Grob attack in the first place. You should be happy the fact that you have some very aggressive pieces right here, and then you're up in material. The last variation we are going to look at is going along the same main line after they play pawn to d5, but now they play something like pawn to e5. More common than you may think. A lot of people like to control the center of the board. They don't know what white is up to, and so they just say, okay, do what you want. I'm not going to do anything crazy as far as taking material here because I'm not sure what you're up to. And I've heard some people talk about the fact that if they don't take your pawn here on g4, but you have the threat still of this bishop on c8, you should go ahead and defend with pawn to h3. If you see yourself playing pawn to h3 in the Grob attack, you're doing it wrong. Play something else. You should probably play something else in general, but if you play the Grob attack, play something more fun. There are way better options that give you more fun than playing pawn to h3. The one that I like the most is pawn to g5. It says, hey, you can now take with your queen, but your queen's the only defender on the square on d5. So sure, go ahead and take my pawn. I'm going to recapture with my bishop here on d5. I'm taking your center pawn. What do you want to do now? And maybe they defend with pawn to c6. Okay, well now we're going to play pawn to d3, opening up for our dark square bishop to attack the queen, forcing them to do something. Now, if they continue along this G file, you need to be aware. So let's say queen to G6. You need to play bishop to F3. You'd really like to play your bishop back here to B3, but the threat you have to be aware of is queen down here to G2, getting ready to take our rook on H1. That is something black's always going to be looking at. You have to be aware of that. So play bishop back here to F3. If instead they play queen to E7, perfect. Now you can play bishop back to b3, and you still have the threat attacking this f7 square. This is definitely the way to go. Now, instead of pawn to c6, you could see knight to f6. Simple development move, attacks the bishop. White doesn't have a huge attack right now, and so you may see this more often than not. I recommend you do not play pawn to d3. Attacking the queen. The queen's going to come back something like g6 since it can't really retreat to e7, and then you're really forced to play that bishop to f3 to stop the queen coming down here to g2. But unfortunately, pawn to e4 is a pain to play against, so just don't do it. It's going to end poorly for you. Just take my word for it. Instead, once they play knight to f6, you can play knight to f3. Now, if you look at this, you say, well, can't they play queen down here to g2? And they can, and that's the whole point of why you did that. This is another trap that many players are going to fall into because they think this is going to be just a terrible move for white. But what white can actually do is take with their bishop here on f7. Check. This is going to force the king to come down, take this material, and this is an important square with the king right here in f7. The reason for that is now we can play rook to g1. Can't take this rook because the knight's protecting it. Can't take the knight because the pawn's protecting it. Can't take this pawn over here because the knight's protecting it. It's attacking this entire g file, so all it can really do is play queen to h3. And now knight up here to g5, forking the king, this queen is now going to fall. So that's why I recommend play that knight to f3. This is something that until you play the Grob attack, which unfortunately I can say that I have played more than I would like to, just as I was prepping for this video. It's just you feel like you should be playing pawn to d3. Computer engines will even tell you this is the better move, but humans fall way more for knight to f3 because they just feel like they need to bring that queen down here to g2. So that's the move I recommend. Also at the beginning, just don't play that pawn to h3. There's way better moves that you can do. So that is the Grob attack. Hopefully for those people who've been requesting it, you like this. If you don't like the Grob attack at all, my guess is you probably never even watched the video, or you watched the first 2 minutes, made a comment that said the Grob attack's terrible, why'd you make this video? That's going to be completely fine. But if you made it to the end, thank you for watching. Not a recommended opening, but I still think it's fun to play. Really, any opening in chess can be fun depending on who you're playing. And if you're playing a blitz game, try this out. See if there's some variations you like in here. My guess is you'll find that black really has no idea how to defend this. You'll get very aware of how to attack your opponents. They'll fall for a lot of the traps we've talked about, and it'll end up being better than you think. So hopefully you guys enjoyed this. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video.